Campus Professor of Abrahamic Religions and Shared Values at the Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge. So welcome to our talk series at Cambridge Interfaith Program. We're very honored to have Professor Ayala Fader with us. We'll have between the three of us, me, Ayala Fader, and Dr. Leah Taragan-Zeller, will have a conversation about her latest book, Hidden Heretics. So how we have thought about it is that Leah and I prepared a few questions. We will ask those questions to her and cover some aspects of her book, and then we will open it to discussion. So it is more like a conversation style than a formal talk. So please contribute with your questions. Since Leah knows Ayala for a long time, I had asked her to introduce her and why she is so important in anthropology, religious studies, Jewish studies. Do you want to go? Go ahead, Leah.
Sure. Thank you, Ezra, and welcome, Ayala. So I'm going to offer a short bio before we go in, and we can start this fun conversation. So Professor Ayala Fader is Professor of Anthropology at Fordham University. In my opinion, and I think not only in my opinion, she is one of the world's leading anthropologists of Judaism, and it's really a pleasure to have her here today. She is the author of Mitzvah Girls, which won the Jewish Book Award in 2009, but we're here today to engage with her new book, Hidden Heretics, Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age, which just came out with Princeton University Press. So Hidden Heretics really offers a really unique ethnographic account of the ways Jewish men and women secretly explore the outside world, both in person and online, while they really try to remain part of their ultra-Orthodox religious communities. And the ethnography really beautifully captures all the stress and the difficulties and these ethical dilemmas that come up with their choices. And I think that today we'll see that it also offers a really powerful analytical framework, which Ayala calls lived out. And I have to say that besides her work on ethics, which I think offered a really important case study in the Jewish context, which her first book does really beautifully and continues in this one, I think that lived out and this context of Hidden Heretics really is quite a hard task to try to capture doubt, and I would say non-belief ethnographically. And she offers this really powerful account that I think has been really missing in anthropology in general and in Jewish studies in particular. So Ayala, you know that my own work has been very inspired by yours, but I know that today a lot of the other people here around us on the screen are also very much inspired by your work. And I guess we will all just introduce Ayala into the kind of Cambridge religious studies milieu, and I think you will all join me in my enthusiasm to enjoy this conversation with Ayala today. So before Ezra and I start nudging Ayala with questions, we asked Ayala to offer a brief description of the book, and I'm sure we will all enjoy it. So on to you.
Thank you so much, Leah. Thanks for that beautiful introduction. You know, of course, that your own work has been inspiring to me too. We've been in conversation for many years now, and it's been a real delight. And actually, Ezra, I've read a lot of your work too, and it's been inspiring in that way too. I want to thank you all for reading my work and for inviting me. It's a treat to be with you. I'm going to begin with a very short story that I'll read to you, and then I'll just lay out a few of the key points from the book, and then we'll have our conversation, which seems like the much more fun part. Okay. So this is the story of Yisroel, and it opens the book. So Yisroel grew up Hasidic in Brooklyn, where, like his peers, he spent long hours studying in yeshiva. But when he was 13, he began to have questions, what are called in Yiddish iminakashes. And when he asked his rabbi about them, he was told that those kinds of questions came from masturbation. So he was silent and he stopped asking. He told me he pushed all his questions under the rug. At 18, he got married to a woman he didn't know, but he grew to adore, Ruchi, and they quickly had 5 kids. But when he was 29, his questions started again. And because he, like so many other Hasidic men, had started working in computers, in IT, he had access to the internet and he began to go online, reading biblical archaeology, philosophy, evolution, many forbidden texts. Late at night, when his family was asleep, alone in the kitchen, he began to go on popular heretical blogs of the day, and then later on chat rooms, arguing with the posters, trying to convince himself and others that the Torah was the word of God revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai, the concept of Matan Torah. And then one late Friday night on Shabbos, or the Sabbath, when his youngest was crying and he knew that turning on the musical mobile above her crib would calm her down, ultra-Orthodox Jews, of course, don't use electricity on the Sabbath. He paused, he put his hand on the switch, yes, no, and he turned it on. And that was when he became what many in the community call in Yiddish Bahaltana Bikorsim, or hidden heretics, those who live double lives, practicing publicly, even at home, but secretly with new friends breaking Jewish law and exploring the wider world of New York City. But despite trying to keep his new beliefs and life secret from his family, his wife Ruchi noticed. And finally she asked him, did he still pray? Did he even believe in God? He confessed everything to her, talking late into the night in their bedroom closet so the kids wouldn't hear. She was devastated, and she told me she cried for 3 days. Was her husband crazy? Would she worry? She worried would her own faith slip? How could she possibly take on responsibility for the spirituality of the house, which is traditionally the realm of the husband? Yisroel was desperate to regain his faith, and he sought out special outreach rabbis to help him, what are called kiruv rabbis, but none did. And then finally, one day, the Modesty Committee, which is a shadowy group of self-appointed activists, called his house. They noticed that he had recently bought a book on science that included evolution for his young daughter. He bought it on Amazon. They wanted him to sign a contract agreeing to stop going on social media, and they wanted him to go see religious therapists who would work closely with his rabbi. He went to a number from fear that his kids would be expelled from school, which would have consequences for matchmaking later on, but nothing helped him. And that was when I met him, just as his world was falling apart. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and his story and how it affected his family is really paradigmatic of the many stories I tell in Hidden Heretics, of ultra-Orthodox Jews who are experiencing life-changing doubt, but because of their families and fears, they cannot leave, or they will not. They stay and try to figure out how to secretly build relationships, dreams, and desires, even while they pretend to live ultra-Orthodox religious lives. The internet plays a key role in their ability to stay, and the worlds they build with new friends and lovers unintentionally and intentionally may be changing ultra-Orthodoxy itself today. So let me just begin by clarifying the concept of doubt. So doubt is inherent to all religions. Doubt in some ways defines and it refines faith. It's expected. Religious leaders and people who adhere to certain religions expect to experience doubt. It ebbs and flows across the life cycle. But this kind of doubt remains individual and interior, and it doesn't really disrupt religious practice. But what I realized from doing fieldwork with Hidden Heretics is that I was talking actually about a different kind of doubt. What I was seeing was a different kind of doubt. And that is the kind of doubt that I call life-changing doubt. It's the doubt that challenges the entire theological structure of, in this case, Jewish orthodoxy. Life-changing doubt refused to stay inside individuals, and it led people to disrupt or stop their religious practice. I think often this kind of life-changing doubt makes people leave their communities, and we can talk about those who leave. But those living double lives couldn't leave. They didn't want to hurt their families, and they were often scared to leave their communities. They didn't feel prepared to live outside their communities. So they stayed, keeping this dramatic change a secret. Eventually, many went online and found others, which created anonymous networks of doubters who over time began to meet secretly in person and explore forbidden worlds together and break Jewish laws away from their families, just like Yisroel did by turning on the light. Life-changing doubt goes beyond the individual, It has familial and communal implications. And even when kept secret, it affected spouses, children, and over the time I was doing fieldwork, it drew increasing attention from religious leadership, from activists, and from religious therapists. Those are all the people who tried to help those with life-changing doubt. So there are other anthropologists who are beginning to work on doubt and what is sometimes called failure or uncertainty. But I feel it's important to make distinctions among doubt, and even in life-changing doubt, I'm happy to talk about it a little bit later. I found a whole continuum of doubt with English and Yiddish categories of different ways of engaging in life-changing doubt. So let me just give you a little context now for these hidden heretics. The numbers of those living double lives and their fellow travelers is really not reliably known. Some people told me, you know, there were 100. Some people told me there were 10,000 worldwide. I think what's really important is that they increasingly figure large in the ultra-Orthodox imagination, as do those who go off the derech or off the path, who leave their communities. I'm sure you all saw Unorthodox. Maybe that's all I have to say. So this is despite ultra-Orthodoxy's real continued robust demographic growth. So while there's a lot of anxiety in the communities about people who leave, in fact, demographically, the communities are thriving. So that's an important point to make. Some religious authorities, rabbis and activists, blamed what they called a, quote, crisis of faith or a crisis of emunah or amina on a religious orthodoxy that had gotten too stringent. And this was often a critique of one kind of ultra-Orthodoxy to another. Some blamed trauma or mental illness, which really pathologized life-changing doubt. And others blamed the internet, particularly smartphones, which created opportunities for private exploration and community building. Because of course, there's always been people living double lives, ultra-Orthodox Jews living double lives. But one of the things I'm arguing is that the internet created new affordances that made it much easier to live a double life. I do want to note that in general, ultra-Orthodox Jews have not historically rejected new technologies or science, for that matter, out of hand, as long as they could be redeemed through Jewish content or Jewish form. So for example, when audio cassettes, if you remember what those are, when those first came out, those were considered really dangerous and threatening. And then over time, as Jewish musicians made Jewish songs for children, and as new, more threatening forms of technology like VHS came out, suddenly cassettes were very kosher, and they're now considered one of the most kosher forms of technology. Television, however, in contrast, was really unable to be controlled. And so that was sort of forbidden, even though, of course, many people sneak televisions into their house. Over this past decade, though, the internet really became a flashpoint for what I see as a wider crisis of authority. Those living double lives tapped into this broader generational backlash of Hasidic and yeshivish men in their late 20s, 30s, and 40s, who had become frustrated and cynical for a whole host of reasons. This included the political leadership, a kind of breakdown over succession among rabbis and rebbes, which made the leadership look very human. There were economic challenges to living in New York City that they felt they weren't prepared for. Especially men had limited access to secular education and sometimes even limited fluency in English, despite being fourth and fifth generation. They were predominantly Yiddish speakers, Hasidic Jews. And finally, the sexual abuse scandals also had an impact where the very people who were charged with caring for children were putting them in danger. So that's the broader context to set the stage for the many folks living double lives who were fed up with what they called the system, and meaning the whole ultra-Orthodox institutional system. I'll just say a little bit about methodology and then we can turn to our conversation. So over 5 years, I followed people living double lives where they let me. So that included online research, so digital ethnography, and in person. I went to parties, I hung out on blogs, I went to bars, I was part of a closed WhatsApp group. So the ethnographic research, the participant observation, really took place across digital and face-to-face contexts. I was lucky that I was able to do that. We are not able to do that yet, hopefully soon. I had a surprising level of access to people living double lives because I discovered they wanted to tell their story. They really were willing to take a risk in terms of risking their anonymity because they wanted their communities to know that they were ethical people. And in that, they were sometimes in debate with people who had left, like who had made the better decision. But I realized about midway through the research that I had to account for the perspective of religious therapists, outreach rabbis, and life coaches, all of those people who were trying to help people living double lives when they were discovered, which was often part of the process. It was called getting outed. I hadn't really planned on studying religious therapy, but as we know, that's what ethnography allows us to do, to figure out as we go along what's important. So I conducted interviews with life coaches and outreach rabbis when I could. They were less eager to talk to me. They told me they didn't want to air dirty laundry. Some of them weren't certified or trained. There were a whole host of reasons why I hadn't expected to have to work much harder to talk to those people, but eventually with time I did. I also did a lot of research with religious therapists who were quite open. I went to conferences and workshops and support groups for training groups for therapists. I think one of the biggest challenges in this research that was quite different from my first research project from Mitzvah Girls was that the real moral weight I felt to protect people's anonymity. So I don't use the real names of people. Of course, anthropologists don't, but I also don't use specific names of, for example, Hasidic groups. I've changed identifying neighborhoods and other personal details. And I actually had to go through a number of consent and reconsent processes, and we can talk about that because the secret identities of those living double lives there was so much to lose, I guess I would say. Like at the end of the day, a number of women said, I'd like to talk to you, but I'm afraid that if I do, I'll be discovered. My husband will divorce me and I'll lose my children. So I was always conducting the research with the sense of the importance of secrets, which was not very easy for me. Of course, much harder for the people I worked with. So I think I'll stop there and maybe we can begin our conversation.
Thank you so much. This was brilliant and, really brought us into the book. Leah, do you mind maybe I ask the first question and then you can continue? I am interested in the backstory, kind of what brought you into this book. I'm an anthropologist, right? Can't help asking such questions. So what brought you to write this book?
Sure. Writing Mitzvah Girls, my first book, I found it really difficult to do the fieldwork. I had expected, because they were Jewish and I'm Jewish, that I would feel comfortable and at home doing the research. And of course, it was a moment in anthropology where anthropologists were allowed and sometimes even encouraged to study at home and not go to faraway exotic places. But I found that I was not comfortable there. And there was a lot of real challenges. The people I was working with were not explicitly trying to make me more religious, but subtly doing outreach. And even though everyone I met was really wonderful, it was morally completely confusing at all times. I feel like I re-entered adolescence and had a huge moment of angst, like, what's it all about? Maybe every anthropologist does that. So when I finished that book, I thought, well, I'm really curious. Since I've done my research, there are these Hasidic bloggers. I'm really curious. I'm going to write one more article, a little more research, and then I'm done. I'm going to totally switch topics. I thought I was going to work on secular Jews. And it was a moment where there was a lot of art, like secular Jewish art. I thought, well, I'm going to totally switch. This is too hard. And then I started to interview one of the bloggers, Hasidic blogger who everyone knows now is Shulam Dean, who wrote an amazing memoir about his own leaving his community. And as I was talking to him and interviewing him, I came to realize that there was this group of people who had this life-changing doubt but didn't leave. I didn't even know that was a category. So I got increasingly intrigued, and I realized there were all these networks of adults. I had been working, with moms and first grade girls. So this was a whole other world. And right at the moment where I started to realize like, oh, something's going on here with the internet and doubt, there was this huge anti-internet rally in New York City, in Queens, at Citi Field, where like 40,000 ultra-Orthodox men gathered and listened to these rabbis all day railing against the internet. And I realized something was happening. I realized that there was a moment of change going on, not caused by the internet, but that the internet was somehow acting like a lightning rod for all of these big changes going on. And I couldn't resist. So the project actually found me more than I found the project.
Wow, that feels so familiar.
Yes, I know,
you described
right?
how you felt while doing your first project. I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah.
Leah?
Well, I was just going to say that it really feeds into the next thing that we wanted to ask you about. Getting into this field of research, I think one of the fun things of doing ethnography is that we find so many surprises on the way. So we wanted to ask you, what were some of your surprises, or what was the biggest surprise for you when you did start this research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to actually list a few of them for you, because there are the surprises that remind you that you yourself are positioned as the ethnographer, right? And I would say the first surprise for me was that the Hidden Heretics did not actually want to become secular Jews as I am. I had assumed that they would all want to live my life, right? Like this life of freedom, not really, but that they would want to embrace secular Judaism. But they didn't. And hearing them sort of try to figure out what it was exactly that they wanted was really both important for me to understand some of the issues, but also to recognize my own, I guess now we would call it bias, but I would just say my own positioning, and to remind me that I had to take a step back and realize that I was coming from a position as well. I think I sort of got, I got lured into complacency because I didn't have to dress modestly when I went and interviewed, the people who were living double lives. I felt like I could be really myself in a way that I hadn't in my first project. Not that I pretended, but I dressed modestly out of respect and in order to gain access. This, I felt much more like myself. And then I realized these people are still really, really different and engaged in a different project. And I have to remember that. So that was really important and surprising. One of the most surprising things to me, and it really shaped the entire theoretical structure of the book, was the ways that people living double lives talked about belief so much. I mean, as an anthropologist of religion, belief has been, since, Talal Assad's critique of Clifford Geertz, is something that we talk about less. It's something that is not necessarily going to be at the forefront of your analysis, but the people that I was talking to and spending time with, really, they kept talking about, like, I lost my faith, I lost my belief, and I didn't have a language for that. I had been reading, all of this contemporary stuff on materiality and embodiment and the sensory experience of religion. And I needed to see if I could find an account for understanding belief that wasn't just a throwback, of course, but that was able to kind of think about belief as somehow complementary to religious practice and embodiment and materiality. And that really led to this kind of theorizing about life-changing doubt, and the way that doubt, I think about doubt as a kind of habit of mind. And I got really interested. I felt the way I could study doubt as an anthropologist was to look at the discursive public moments. And I don't just mean public, but I mean the inner creation of a public kind of space, the discursive moments where people talk about both interiority, where they talk about doubt. And that was very well suited to online research. Because on blogs and then later in chat rooms and on Facebook and on WhatsApp, people were talking about doubt and faith, and in ways that I really wasn't prepared to analyze. And so I felt like I had to kind of build on the wonderful new research that looked at things like religious practice and material religion and all of that, but include really the discursive practice of doubt, how people talk about that, which also made me focus on language. And I guess the last thing I would say, this is a lot of surprises. The last thing I would say is that I was surprised, and I shouldn't have been, at the gendered experience of doubt. I shouldn't have been, because of course this is a society where gender difference is so highly elaborated, and my first book was all about that. But somehow I hadn't realized that the process of life-changing doubt, of actually changing what you understand both theologically and socially about the world, would be gendered. But it was for all kinds of structural reasons, meaning women had less access to technology. Women at the point of marriage across the life cycle got much more, had less independence, while men at the point of marriage had much more independence. I mean, I spent a lot of afternoons hanging out in downtown Brooklyn in a Barnes and Noble with a bunch of guys who clearly had nothing else to do but sit around and drink coffee and talk about the world while their wives were home watching the kids. So there were structural reasons, but there were also really fascinating emotional reasons, emotional explanations, both emotional experiences and explanations for life-changing doubt. So the women I talked to, and at first I actually realized I was never talking to women. It took me a little while to realize that also. In my first book, again, I mainly spent time with women, in fact, exclusively. But in this, I realized I was talking only to men, and I had to ask the men I was talking to, like, where are the women here? Finally, I met some, and the women described their life-changing doubt as making them furious, making them really, really angry, because they felt they had sacrificed many things in order to participate. And once they decided those structures were no longer true and that theology was no longer true, they were like, why did I even bother? Whereas men were usually devastated. They were really inconsolable. Many considered suicide. I hadn't also expected that kind of sense of loss. I should have, but I didn't. And because of that kind of affective difference in doubt, rabbis and religious therapists and life coaches also use those explanations. They said men were having intellectual questions, which was kind of prestigious, even if it was too bad, whereas there was something emotionally wrong with women. They were unhappy, they were sexually promiscuous. So the explanations for the doubting, as well as the experience, were gendered, and the consequences were gendered as well, because even though it was really, I think one of the biggest reasons that people stayed was for their children and their parents, actually, but their children, they were afraid that if their spouse decided to remain religious and to ask for a divorce, that they would be forced to give a divorce and then potentially lose custody of their children. But again, women had fewer resources to fight those kind of legal battles, especially because communities often throw all of their resources behind the spouse who's still religious in this effort to save the kids, you know?
Excellent, thank you. So you already touched on the doubt a lot, obviously it's central to the book, but we wondered, how would you differentiate between what you call regular doubt and lived doubt, and what is regular about the regular doubt?
Yes, that's also a good question. The kind of just doubt that's part of religious faith, I would say, is again central to the experience of faith. The kind of doubt that disrupts, I mean, we could think about that as sort of similar to a lot of anybody who has a secret double life in some ways, right? And I think some of the ethical compromises that Hidden Heretics make is really shared among anybody who goes through a kind of dramatic change of who they are. And I sort of tried to say that, like, for people who have grown up one way and decided to change, I think there are some resonances there, either politically, sexually, like there's all kinds of dramatic changes that people make that differentiate them from their communities. So in a way, it's a kind of broader personal change that has familial and communal implications. One therapist that I quoted in the book, she was Jewish but not religious. She called living a double life having an affair with another culture. And maybe that's right. But I guess one of the issues that sort of comes out of this and that's central to life-changing doubt is the issue of secrets and how we manage them, who we keep them from, where we share secrets. I talk a little bit about the public secret, the secret that everybody knows but won't say. And I would also note that people who were hidden heretics didn't even like the term double life. I mean, they used it, that's not my term, but the book was originally called Double Life. And all of the people living double lives were like, no, we don't like that. We don't like that title at all. Don't use that, because they felt that it was duplicitous. It sort of hinted that they were like spies or having affairs, and some of them were, but that they were telling lies and keeping secrets. So I was actually very happy when I discovered that there was this Yiddish term that some people also used of hidden heretics. But I decided to use double life because that was the term that so many people used, even though they didn't like it. I'd also say that if we're sort of comparing other people who live double lives and engage in certain kinds of life-changing doubt, there's a new term that's called ITC that I mentioned too, in the closet. And it's a reference to, of course, LGBTQ closeting. And I thought about the closet as a metaphor, of course, while I was writing and Cedric's work, but there are differences that are very particular to this kind of community, and that make the kind of life-changing doubt, I think in some ways, kind of unique to illiberal or non-liberal religious communities, because for parents who were living double lives, the revelation of the kinds of changes that they were going through, the kind of public revealing, had such serious consequences, not only for losing their children in cases of divorce, but because of matchmaking, what are called shidduchim or shidduchim. But matchmaking, or so arranged marriages, are all about families. They're not so much about individuals. I mean, there's an individual component, but they're really about the joining of families. So if a parent was revealed to have life-changing doubt and left the community or was kicked out of the community, as some were, the kind of stain on the family would be really, really serious. And so individuals knew that if they didn't keep their life-changing doubt a secret, there were implications for future generations of their own family, as well as hurting their parents. A lot of them talked about that. They said, I would break my parents' heart. These are communities who live in close proximity to each other. Everyone lives sort of in the same neighborhood. And if they don't, there's a lot of travel back and forth to Israel or Stamford Hill or wherever. And so there was a real sense of personal responsibility. And that was the motivating fact for keeping life-changing doubt a secret. I guess one way I also thought about the life-changing doubt that enabled living double lives was the way that publics encounter publics, the anonymous, probably anonymously at first, but that the ways that people who were living life-changing doubt still felt the need to reach out to each other, despite all of these, threats to their family and to themselves. And that was really the key piece of digital media. It provided a safe space to gather with others. Almost everyone told me that they didn't experience life-changing doubt because they went online. They all attributed that to reading, sneaking into public libraries, illicit reading, basically. So we all know that books are dangerous. And they confirmed that. I think younger hidden heretics do sometimes go online and become, and their faith is sort of shaken. But at least for people in their 30s and 40s, it was mostly books. But what digital media did provide was this space to meet with other people and to see that they weren't insane, because the general communal explanation for life-changing doubt is a certain kind of mental illness. There's been a greater openness to the therapeutic framework and treating mental illnesses, but the kind of flip negative side of that is if you're not conforming in some ways, including wanting to question, there's sort of an unwillingness to accept, until much more recently, an unwillingness to accept that some people might just not believe things anymore, that other truths might be more convincing than the giving, divine revelation. That was an unacceptable situation. And so there was a kind of pathologizing, as I mentioned, of people who had life-changing doubt. So to find other people online who were clearly not crazy, who were intelligent, quote unquote, normal people, I think was incredibly validating. And it made people living double lives who were experiencing that kind of doubt, it gave them a kind of confidence. And it also gave them a place to start to experiment with different kinds of subjectivities, to sort of express different aspects of themselves, to start to talk between men and women, to eventually meet up. And so I guess one of the really interesting parts for me about life-changing doubt is where and how different publics that can tolerate them, or that the affordances of particular kinds of publics and counter publics actually encourage this kind of life-changing doubt. We know that no technology or medium is going to actually create something. We can't say, obviously, that the internet creates democracy, since we know that it doesn't. But there are certain affordances of different media that I think are really important to study, because it's going to encourage or discourage certain kinds of publics and counter publics, which include cultural critique.
Thank you so much, Ayala. I have so many other questions besides the ones that I said that I was going to ask, so I will stick with them. But I've read the book and there's still so much in it, and it's really quite amazing. So we wanted to ask a little bit about living a double life, and I was really struck by what you just said about having an affair with another culture. It's such an interesting comparison to think about. And what we wanted to really ask is about, what does your research say about living double in other contexts, really, and to push a little bit about other examples, other spaces, who lives those types of lives, why, under what conditions, and, how is this different? We keep on going to like affairs as one option, but there's many other comparisons that we can think of living double in. And I guess it's a broad question about what comes into your mind, and what does this type of living double say for other contexts, I think?
I think I answered that question with this question, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. Sorry about that. I guess I would return to that issue of the closet. And people who are keeping secrets and all of that kind of stuff. And I think we all, to some extent, live a double life, right? There are, and the people, the hidden heretics that I talked with always reminded me of that. There are always parts of ourselves that we don't share, including in the most intimate spaces of domesticity, right? You don't tell your family everything about yourself at all times. So watching double lives, people who are living double lives, sort of navigate these ethical decisions about how much to tell and who to tell and who to trust and who not to trust, and how that changed over time as well. I think, to me, that raised the broader issue of what kinds of ethical negotiations go on particularly in families. I got really interested in the kind of ethics in families. There's been a lot of wonderful work on ethical self-cultivation, but it's been really often at the level of the individual, and it's been at the level of the sort of individual cultivation of the self. And what I was able to see with people living double lives is that actually, in fact, many of these kinds of ethical negotiations and choices that people were making happened intersubjectively with other people, and particularly with people in their families. So the kinds of decisions that that people made about, for example, how much they would include a child in their own kinds of journeys in terms of experimentation, how much they would reveal to their spouse, because revealing, of course, your life-changing doubt to your spouse was really, really threatening to a large extent. It was taking a risk. So again, I would go back to the secrets and in terms of ethics also, like how much are we revealing? Maybe, I guess more broadly, Leah, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe it's a move to not have our studies of religious life be so so certain that the people we're working with are so sincere in some ways. You know, there's been a lot of sort of assumptions that religious subjects are always trying to be the most pious or trying to be, you know, to be the most ethical subject. I think in some ways this opens up the kind of conversation to what about people who are, you know, kind of marginalized from their religious communities for all kinds of reasons. I think about an article that Webb Keen wrote that I really like, where he said, you know, you're in a church and everybody's participating, but what about the little boy in the back of the church who's really bored and can't wait to go home and, you know, is secretly reading a comic book? So I think our accounts of religious communities have to include those kind of people. So maybe that kind of hidden double life could expand in that way, both methodologically and theoretically, in the kinds of people we study.
Excellent. If you also agree, I'll ask our next question, and then after that, let's open it up. And then if, you know, there are not that many questions, which I doubt, then we can continue.
Okay.
Okay. So the final question I want to ask then is, you know, I told you that Daniel Weiss and I read your book in our class, Atheism in Abrahamic Religions.
Yes.
And there we had talked about, you know, what is Jewish, or you know, we talked about, are there specific atheisms that are specific to certain religions? And there is a lot of, you know, talk about Jewish atheism also. So then I wondered, is there something Jewish about this doubt? Is it American? Is it 21st century? Yeah, what do you think about the Jewish aspect of this doubt?
Yeah, I really loved that question. Because I think it's both very American and very Jewish. I mean, of course, there are hidden heretics wherever there are ultra-Orthodox Jews. And I know in Israel, for example, they're called Anusim. I corresponded with some who were in London. But I think one of the things that's really distinctive about this kind of doubting, and that makes it so Jewish, is the temporality. I was really interested and puzzled at first to see that people living double lives called themselves maskilim often. That is Jewish enlighteners. It's a reference to the Jewish Enlightenment, which is the Haskalah. But they call themselves maskilim because they and rabbinic authorities were kind of engaged in this temporal drama where threats to Jewish orthodoxy are always the same, and where references to past generations in some ways are a kind of resource that people with doubts can draw on in order to gain some legitimacy. So, for example, for hidden heretics who called themselves Jewish enlighteners, and this was also gendered, I never heard a hidden heretic who was a woman call herself a Jewish enlightener, although there were certainly Jewish enlighteners who were women, but okay. But what they were referring to was this moment in Eastern Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, where it was actually a very similar time frame. It forced me to do some historical work, which I hadn't been prepared to do, but I was really happy to do because it gave me a sense that, again, temporal drama. But at that moment in Eastern Europe, there were threats of Jewish atheism, Jewish social movements like communism, Zionism. It was a real moment of upheaval. And the Jewish Enlightenment happened at this moment where there also was a dramatic change in technology, which was the printing press, right? So very consciously, Hidden Heretics said that they were like this generation of Jewish doubters. The Jewish Maskilim, Jewish enlighteners, were not atheist. I had assumed they were. That was the version I had heard again. But in fact, what the enlighteners were trying to do was to use these new technologies, including languages, different literacies, and actually reclaim true orthodoxy that was beyond, they felt was going in the wrong direction. And the same way that Hidden Heretics today like to claim that they're saving orthodoxy, meaning that they don't want to become secular, as I mentioned, but they think that the move towards stringency is actually some kind of corruption of authentic Judaism. But what you have then are Hidden Heretics, anonymously but publicly claiming that they are actually the keepers of traditional Judaism. And then you have rabbis who are, referring to this moment of the internet as parallel to and similar to the Holocaust, the Spanish Inquisition and slavery in Egypt. Like, I went to a women's lecture where those three images were all compared to this moment. So that sense of Jewish time, I do think, makes it very Jewish in some ways. And again, in that way, it separates them from many other kinds of people living double lives and experiencing life-changing doubt. And I would wonder about other communities and their temporal dramas, I'm sure, because that kind of merges theology with history in all kinds of interesting ways. But I think the focus on interiority that I saw in my work, that crisis of faith, while very Jewish, is also very American. So there is a Jewish theology, which focuses on practice, right? And this is often contrasted to Christianity, particularly to Protestantism, where practice is supposed to cultivate interior trust in God, or emunah. So practice cultivates the right feelings. So even if you don't feel the right things, as long as you keep the commandments, those feelings will come. And that's what I mean about kind of regular doubt. So there's the idea like, okay, you're not feeling it today, but still say the prayers and those feelings will come eventually. And indeed, I saw that in my first book, where little children were taught that explicitly. But when life-changing doubt disrupted that, and when people didn't want to practice anymore, or when religious authorities felt that practice or other things like material things like clothing were no longer enough to actually protect people and ensure that life-changing doubt remained in people's private interior spaces and was not acted on, there was a growing concern, and that's what I mean by public discourse, about interiority, meaning that people talked about it, and that whole innovation of frum or religious therapy became a way that it was an innovation, really, that a way to address Jewish interiors in a kosher way, but drawing on popular psychology and American self-help. So kind of merging what I see, drawing on some of the work of historian Andrew Hines, is a merging of Musar texts, which are Jewish ethical texts, with New Age sort of self-help popular psychology. And that happened to be an excellent fit, ironically, and it changed. It really changed the idea of the person in lots of subtle, interesting ways. So that I think in Musar, I haven't read that much Musar, but my understanding is in Jewish philosophy, the individual needs to be trained through discipline, and it's a really kind of dark view of human urges and nature, whereas more contemporary, that kind of merging with the therapeutic framework made space for mental issues that were beyond the individual's fault. Of course, it led to a kind of biologized sense of illness, of mental illness, but it was a little bit more compassionate in a way that it acknowledged that it was that people who didn't conform it wasn't always their fault or their lusts or their evil inclination, that there were real reasons, pathological, of course, or maybe psychodynamic reasons that a person was unable to continue to practice, that something disrupted their practice. So I think both very American and very Jewish. And I'm really curious actually to hear from all of you too, like what your sense is of that and what you've been talking about Jewish atheism.
Okay, thank you so much. This is excellent starting for our conversation. So now we will stop the recording and we will open it for questions.